Good evening, everyone. And welcome once again to our Bhagavad-gita Satsang. It's an honor to have you here with me, a pleasure for me to be here with you. I want to thank all of you for choosing to spend your time with me. Special shout out to Tess. Thank you very much for being here. It is very nice to see you here again. And Kamala Radha, proof, if you look in the chat window, that if I don't write it down, it doesn't happen. I'll write it down. Jess, nice to see you. Kevin, thank you very much for being here. And all of you who are now just joining us or joining us after the fact. Let us get to our housekeeping. I've already got one wave, so I am going to assume one wave means all waves, that you can all hear me. If you can't hear me, wave. Yeah, see, now all your hands went down. Ha ha, fooled you. All right, for those of you who are new to the satsang, you can adjust your audio settings and viewing options in the upper right-hand corner, which is also where you will find me when I'm sharing the screen. You don't have to worry about your microphone or your video camera because I cannot see or hear you, but you can see and hear me. If you would like to be heard, type something into the chat or the Q&A box. I will be watching both of those. Last time, from the road, we finished up chapter 12, the Yoga of Devotion. We spoke about the characteristics of Krishna's devotees, a little bit about turning the other cheek and indifference to mundane affairs. I'm going to speak a little more this evening about the immortal essence of religious principles as we transition from the section on Bhakti Yoga, the middle 6 chapters, to the final 6 chapters of Bhagavad-gita, beginning with chapter 13, the Yoga of Reflection on Spirit and Matter. You have heard me speak in earlier classes about the elliptical structure of the Bhagavad-gita, and as we enter this portion of the Gita, we will find that Arjuna will now ask more faith-based questions, and those questions will circle back to topics discussed as early as the 2nd chapter of Bhagavad-gita, when Krishna begins his instructions. We will speak this evening about the field and the knower of the field, and a little bit about the doctrine of transformation of energies as found in the Vedanta-sutra, also sometimes known as the Brahma Sutra. And that's how it will be referred to in the Bhagavad-gita in the verses we're covering this evening. So before we proceed, our invocation mantra, the dot over the M indicates that we close the back of our tongue against the back of the roof of our mouth at the same time that we bring our lips together in front. Bars over vowels indicate an open and slightly elongated version of that vowel. And with that, I will chant, and you can chant back if you like. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. The translation: I offer my respects to the Supreme Person, the Son of Vasudeva, who is the all-pervading transcendence. So, closing out last week, we finished with the 20th verse of the 12th chapter, wherein Krishna says, indeed, those who revere this immortal essence of religious principles that I have spoken, and who with full faith completely engages themselves in making me the supreme goal of their lives are deeply loved by me. There are 4 points about the immortal essence of religious principles as opposed to what I will call pretentious religion. Pretentious religion bordering even on irreligion. The real essence of religion, and let's remember that here our definition of religion is again to connect, as in the Latin etymological root of the English word religion. So the essence of reconnection, spiritual reconnection, is the natural inborn quality of all living beings. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali tells us that one who has succeeded in stilling the mind arrives at the realization of their true nature, which is to say that we are spiritual by nature. And it is our nature to be connected to the ultimate spiritual source of everything. So the real essence of religion or reconnection is our natural condition, is our normal quality. Pretentious religion is a form of covering, of ignorance, of vidya, that's artificially obscuring our natural inborn spiritual condition while passing as a means to connect on a spiritual level. So how do we recognize this kind of artificial or pretentious religion as opposed to eternal religious principles? If there's some material motivation, for starters, if it's rooted in the fulfillment of material rather than spiritual desires, that's one way. When there's mental speculation about what the truth might be, as opposed to receiving transcendental knowledge through a trustworthy source of transcendental knowledge. Religion that doesn't have, or I should say a faith form that does not have a process by which one can turn theoretical knowledge into experiential knowledge. These are all symptoms of, let's say, superficial religion. And that is certainly not what Krishna is speaking about when he speaks about the immortal essence of religious principles. So as long as we are encumbered by this kind of superficial religiosity, as long as that dominates our mental conception, then our natural connection is dormant. And it can be awakened by hearing these essential elements of religious principles with a pure heart, with the desire to understand and advance in our spiritual lives. It really only takes sincerity and inquiry. To get into just a few moments of a little bit more detail on how we can recognize those kinds of superficial forms of religiosity that fall short of this essential universal principle of connection. You can think of religion as having or being 4 different paths: a path of sense enjoyment, a path of knowledge, a path of mystic power, and a path of devotional service. So the path of sense enjoyment is a kind of shallow monotheism where we expect God, or whatever our conception of God is one of our servant, and we pray to a supreme being to fulfill our desires, as opposed to ask the supreme being for the opportunity to fulfill the supreme being's desires. The idea of who's the servant and who is the served becomes conflated. This can also show up in polytheism, worship of different devas or demigods in order to get a material benediction. The desire for our own satisfaction is still the central element here. And the problem, of course, is that even if one achieves or acquires the most perfect situation of material happiness, it's going to be temporary. You have 4 problems of material life: old age, disease, death, and rebirth. And nothing about materialistic religiosity is going to solve that problem. And as far as the kind of sacrifices that one performs, rituals that one performs for the sake of appeasing a demigod, it's very difficult to perform such ceremonies. Whatever success one attains is temporary. Krishna throughout the Gita has maintained that this kind of what in Sanskrit is called karma kanda, working with the idea or acting in the idea that you will enjoy the fruits of your actions, is really for a less intelligent person. No sane person would be satisfied with the temporary benefits of materialistic religion. The path of knowledge, jnana yoga in Sanskrit, has the problem of promoting an attachment to the impersonal feature of the Supreme, and therefore it negates or minimizes devotional service to the Supreme Person. And this is precisely what Krishna is saying is the topmost thing. So one who is engaged in mental speculation or trying to achieve enlightenment through an intellectual breakthrough, reason one's way to God, doesn't really have standing to engage in devotional service to the Supreme Person due to this minimization of the position of the Supreme Person in favor of an impersonal conception into which one wants to merge. In other words, the idea that one can become God or realize that one is God. And then finally, the religiosity of mysticism, the mystic powers described in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, they can make the yogi materially very powerful and give some temporary relief from the 4 miseries that I mentioned earlier: birth, death, disease, and old age. But material science can also do this by virtue of advanced medical technology and such like that. And once again, it's not permanent, and one can be diverted from the actual goal or the actual activity that Patanjali encourages in his Yoga Sutras, which is surrender to the Supreme Person. So none of the above kind of materialistic paths of religiosity are actually recommended in the Bhagavad-gita. In the first section of the Bhagavad-gita, the first 6 chapters, Krishna describes how karma develops into karma yoga, and karma yoga informed by jnana or knowledge develops into bhakti, or bhakti yoga. And then in the middle section that we have just concluded, Krishna speaks specifically about himself and the process of bhakti yoga, the whole idea of relationship with the Supreme Person is the ultimate goal of yoga. He speaks about the relationship between the individual self and the supreme self, and also the individual soul and the super soul within the heart of each soul, and describes devotional service as the highest platform of yoga. So, rejecting all of these lesser conceptions of materialistic religion or speculative religion, or impersonal conceptions of the absolute. Now, in the last 6 chapters, Krishna and Arjuna will discuss how the living entity comes into contact with material nature, how a spiritual soul comes into contact with the material body in this material world. And this section is understood to be the section of jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge. And once again, Krishna is going to show how jnana yoga finds its ultimate fulfillment in bhakti, and how one is delivered by the Supreme Person through the different methods that he has already spoken about: karma yoga and jnana yoga and bhakti yoga. So we begin the 13th chapter with Arjuna's question, and he's going to begin by asking about 3 pairs of topics, and we are going to chant this first verse. So let's bring that back up onto the screen. Oh, no, that's not what we're going to do. I forgot my own process. We're going to go through each of the verses first. Then we will come back and chant the first 2 verses of this chapter and look at each of these verses in detail. So, beginning with verse 1a. The reason I've designated this verse 1a as opposed to just 1 is because in some editions of the Bhagavad-gita, you won't find this verse at all. I'm not exactly sure why that is. The verse may have shown up later just to indicate that what subject matter Krishna is addressing. So sages, there is a historical development, there is a history of the Bhagavad-gita, and at some point in time, this verse may have been added in order to give us an indication of where Krishna is going and what topics are being covered in accordance with Arjuna's desire to have further understanding. Other editions of the Gita simply have this verse without any question. So I have designated the first verse 1a, the second verse 1b, and that may mean that in your edition of the Gita, you will find that my numbering and the numbering in your edition are not quite right or not aligned. And that's why I just decided that, at least for now, as I was looking at this, that would be the best way to do it. So we begin with Arjuna's question. Arjuna said, "O Keshava, I wish to understand material nature and the spiritual person, the field and the knower of the field, knowledge and the object of knowledge." Verse 1b, the beloved Lord said, "O son of Kunti, this body is called the field, and those with a complete understanding of this call the one who knows the body the knower of the field." Verse 2, "O descendant of Bharat, understand that I am also the knower of the field in all bodies. In my opinion, knowledge is the understanding of both this body and its knower." Verse 3, Now, hear my summary of what the nature of this field of activity is, what its transformations are, and how they originate, who the knower of the field of activities is, and what the powers of the knower are. Verse 4, sages have sung of this in various ways, in numerous kinds of sacred Vedic hymns, especially in the aphorisms that encapsulate knowledge of absolute reality with conclusive logic. Text 5 and 6 together. The 5 great elements, the false ego, the intelligence, the unmanifested, the 10 senses along with the 11th, the mind, the 5 sense objects, desire, aversion, happiness, sorrow, the total sum and substance, consciousness and constancy. All these are considered in summary to be the field of activities and its transformations. So, in some of your editions, you might find this as leaving off at verse 7 rather than 6. And I will trust you to figure out how to navigate this differential. All right, so now let's go back and look at each verse in detail, and we'll begin with chanting this first verse. So, a quick note about the transliterated Sanskrit. I already explained the bar over the vowel. A dot under an R indicates that you're going to curl your tongue up and bring it about 2/3 of the way back on the roof of your mouth. R. Whereas a R without a dot is a quick trill off of the cliff behind the ridge behind your top teeth. A C is a CH sound. 2 vowels together are actually each pronounced as opposed to merging into one. There's a little bit of mushing together, but they're actually meant to be, each letter is meant to be pronounced. A dot under an S is an SH sound. A tilde over an N is a ña sound. And when it appears after a J, as it does here, then it turns the J into a G sound. So, yeah. 2 C's together are also both pronounced. And since the C is a CH sound, when you see an H after a C, I hope you all followed that, it's simply a matter of putting some extra air after the CH sound. And the accent mark over an S is also an SH sound, but it's a deeper SH sound that is sounded from the back of one's mouth. So a kind of a pink noise, as opposed to a regular white noise, sh. And there, that should cover it. So here we go. I chant one line at a time. You chant each line back. Arjuna uvacha prakṛtim puruṣam kṣaiva kṣetra-jñam eva ca ettadveditum iccāmi jñānaṁ jñeyaṁ kṣetra-jña. Translation. Arjuna said, "O Keshava, I wish to understand material nature and the spiritual person, the field and the knower of the field, knowledge, the object of knowledge." So, Keshava is a name of Krishna in the Bhagavad-gita, usually taken to mean the killer of the Keshi demon. It also means one with beautiful unshorn hair. It's one of the many names of Vishnu. Oops. Come back to that in just a moment. Okay. So I will admit that I took an interpretive approach to this translation for the sake of clarity. Prakṛtim is nature. The implication is material nature. Puruṣam simply means person, sometimes translated as the enjoyer, one who is enjoying or attempting to be the enjoyer of material nature. And that person, puruṣa, specifically indicates a soul, a spiritual person, as opposed to a mundane conception of a person as a human being or something like that. So for the sake of clarity, Arjuna would like to understand nature and the person, which sounds a little obtuse. So material nature and the spiritual person, because our discussion now is going to circle back to this distinction between matter and spirit, or the body and the person within the body, which is another way of saying the field of action, the field of activity, and the knower of the field, the body, the person who knows the body, the collection of senses and sense objects with which the senses interact, and the person who experiences those interactions. And then finally, jñānaṁ, knowledge, and jñeyaṁ, the object of knowledge. So what is knowledge, and where should that knowledge be directed? Or what does knowledge consist of? And where should one's knowledge be reposed? Or to put it another way, what does knowledge consist of, and what does it add up to? What is the purpose of knowledge, as opposed to knowledge for the sake of being able to get a high score on Jeopardy? Arjuna wants to know, what's the ultimate purpose of knowing something? So now Krishna will respond, and we will chant this verse as well. So now I've designated this 1b. In some of your editions, this will be verse 2. In some, it'll just be verse 1. The diacritical marks for this are the same. I think we managed to squeeze every diacritical mark into the last verse. The only thing I see here to know is that a Y at the end of a word is a y sound that moves right into the next word, the vowel that begins the next word, as opposed to being an I sound or an E sound. So in this particular verse, the second line that Krishna speaks has the word iti, but for the sake of the grammatical rule that places the right number of syllables in the line and makes it sound right, it becomes a Y and merges into the next word. We will pronounce both T's when we see the two T's. We hit the first T, slam on the brakes, and then proceed with the second T. So once again, I chant each line, you chant each line back. Shri Bhagavanu Vacha Idam Shariram Kaunteya Kshetram Ityabhidhiyate etadyo vettitam prahuhu kṣetra-jña iti tadvidaha. And I was wrong. We didn't cover every diacritical mark in the last verse because the last two lines have words where there's a dot under the H at the end of the word, at the end of the line. Therefore, the vowel that precedes the H is echoed back. And that's why I echoed it back. I hope you did too. Translation: the beloved Lord said, O son of Kunti, this body is called the field, and those with a complete understanding of this call the one who knows the body the knower of the field. So in this verse, we have the words kṣetram and kṣetra-jña. So jña as in jnana, knowledge, kṣetra, field. You may recall the very first verse of the Bhagavad-gita begins with dharma kṣetra, kuru-kṣetra, on the field of righteousness known as kuru-kṣetra, the field of the Kurus. What did my sons and the sons of Pandu do, having assembled there to fight? So kṣetra, the field. This is one reason why we will sometimes find allegorical interpretations of the battlefield of Kurukshetra meaning the body, because here Krishna is using this same language. Arjuna and Krishna are using this language of the field of activities to describe the body and the senses and the interactions of the senses and the transformations that the body undergoes. And sorry, lost my train of thought for a second. Oh, so therefore sometimes we get this allegorical idea of the battlefield isn't a real battlefield. The whole thing is just a metaphor for the body. I personally do not accept this allegorical interpretation. As I've said in previous classes, both literal understanding and metaphorical understanding are necessary for a complete understanding of the Bhagavad-gita. With just an allegorical understanding, you lose a tremendous amount that's self-evident in the meaning of the text. And without a metaphorical understanding, you also lose some practical application. So both have value. So Krishna replies to Arjuna's query by addressing the second pair of topics and the first part of the third pair. He talks about knowledge as understanding the distinction between the body and the self, that those who actually understand what the body is call the person within the body the knower of the field. So part of our understanding of these material bodies, the first part, is that it's not us. And we get different material bodies according to our karma. According to the reactions to past actions, we are awarded different levels of ability to arrange material nature in such a way as to fulfill our material desires. One who is observant sees how the progression of the body, the changes of the body happen, but there's a person within the body who experiences those changes who is not changed. There's an app on social media I forgot. Anyway, there's some social media app that's going around where you can see how you're going to look in 40 years, how you will age. It's the aging app. So I had a friend who posted something about they use this app to see like what they're going to look like in 40 years. And there you go. Ashes, dust. In 40 years, I'll be 103 years old. That's probably what kind of transformation this body will go through. It'll basically be dust. So it's a good thing that I'm not this body, if that's what my body is going to look like in 40 years. All of the transformations of the body give us a clear indication that we're not these bodies, because we remember when we were in little children bodies, and we remember when we were in young adult bodies, and maybe some of us are in young adult bodies now, and I assure you that if you live long enough, you'll remember what that was like, sort of. And you'll certainly be able to tell the difference between the body you used to have and the body you've got now. And there won't be any question that it's not the same body. Realization that one is not the body is the preliminary stage of liberation. It's considered enlightenment in the mode of goodness. So we begin with theoretical knowledge that we are not these bodies. We're given a practice, principles, ways to live, sadhana, that when observed, bring us to this state of actually experiencing ourselves as not this body. And that's the first stage of enlightenment, the actual experience of not being one's body. Let's have, if anyone has any questions at this point, or if anyone wants to mention me on an Instagram post, now's a really good time to do that. I will be looking at the Q&A box and the chat to see if you have any comments or questions. Meanwhile, let's move on to our next verse. Krishna continues, "O descendant of Bharata, understand that I am also the knower of the field in all bodies. In my opinion, knowledge is the understanding of both this body and its knower." So once again, Krishna is clearly identifying himself as the Param Atma, the Supreme Soul within the heart of all souls. And he's also giving his opinion, which never ceases to kind of crack me up, because he's the Supreme Being. He's established himself, even in this verse, as the omniscient Supreme Being. And he's sharing his opinion with us rather than telling us what to do or how to think. So we now find that we have three topics of study when we're discussing the body and the knower of the body. There's the material body itself, there's the individual soul within the body, and then there's the super soul within all bodies. And because the super soul is an expansion of the Supreme Personality, we understand that it's not just a trite cliche that God is within our hearts. Krishna has just said, that's where I am, that's where you can find me. So the distinction is that an individual soul knows something about their own body. There's plenty going on in my body that I'm completely oblivious to. Most of what happens with my body is autopilot, and unless I injure some part of my body, I may not even be aware of my nerve endings there. But Krishna, in his expansion as the Paramatma, is completely aware of everything going on in everyone's body all the time. Hence inconceivable, because I don't think any of us can really imagine what that might be like. So perfect knowledge is the understanding of the constitutional nature of the material body as being temporary and subject to transformations, coming into being, staying for some time, never really staying exactly the same for even a moment, and then eventually disappearing, going out of existence. The constitution of the individual soul as an infinitesimal spark of consciousness that is part of the Supreme Soul, and therefore the constitution of the Supersoul is therefore understood to be the omniscient, omnipresent Supreme Being. That knowledge, just that by itself, that understanding of those three things in Vedic literature is called jnana, or knowledge. So when we speak about knowledge in the Vedic tradition, that's what we're talking about. That's what the Vedic tradition considers to be knowledge. And we're going to get a further definition of knowledge and a more expansive understanding of knowledge next time when we proceed to the following set of verses. So the other thing to consider when we speak about Atma and Paramatma is the interpretation of impersonal philosophies, namely the idea that the Atma and the Paramatma are one. And this is a case of the Atma speaking to itself. And I do not subscribe to this idea, frankly, just because it doesn't make sense. Popular though it may be, if one aspect of the one is giving knowledge to another aspect of the same one, then how can that be? One must ask, I think, reasonably. Because if they're one, there's no different aspect to give knowledge to. Let's just suspend logic for a moment and say the one has two aspects. If they're one, then one aspect would know what the other aspect knows, because they're one. If there's no difference. So if they're one, there's no possibility of two aspects, nor is there any possibility that one aspect would not know something the other aspect knows. So just on the basis of that simple logic, I think it's safe to say that Krishna is making a clear distinction here. The meaning is self-evident. There's the body, there's the individual soul, and there's the Supreme Soul. And the body exists or is real in the sense that we experience it, and the individual soul is real, and the Supreme Soul is also real. There's a verse in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad that speaks about three conceptions of Brahman. Prakṛti, or nature, is Brahman as the field of activities. Jiva, the individual soul, is Brahman as the individual part of reality that in its conditioned state is trying to control material nature. And the Paramatma is the actual controller of all of the above, the knower of everything. The difference between the jiva and the Paramatma is, or the Atma and the Paramatma, one is fallible, subject to be under the influence of illusion, and the other is not. So they're one insofar as they're both spiritual, qualitatively the same, but they're different quantitatively. insofar as one is omniscient and the other is not. Which brings us to the next verse. 3 in my book, 4 possibly in yours. Now, hear my summary of what the nature of this field of activity is, what its transformations are, and how they originate, who the knower of the field of activities is, and what the powers of the knower are. This verse kind of goes right into the next verse. So, verse 4, sages have sung of this in various ways, in numerous kinds of sacred Vedic hymns, especially in the aphorisms that encapsulate knowledge of absolute reality with conclusive logic. So, numerous kinds of sacred hymns indicates the hymns that are found in the Vedas. And Krishna places a special emphasis on the Vedanta-sutras, aphorisms that encapsulate knowledge of absolute reality with conclusive logic. In this verse, he actually specifically uses the Sanskrit phrase Brahma Sutra. So Brahma Sutra and Vedanta Sutra refer to the same collections of codified instructions that are meant to provide a summary study of the philosophical conclusions of the Upanishads. The specific word that Krishna uses to describe Vedic literatures is Chandobhihi. And the details about what Krishna is speaking, a summarized version of, can be found in these Vedic literatures and specifically in the Vedanta Sutra. One thing that's interesting about this is that Krishna is invoking the authority of Vedanta. That is to say, he himself is using the Vedic system of checks and balances called Guru, Shastra, Sadhu. Krishna himself is in the position of Guru as teacher of Arjuna. He is referring to Shastra, and he has also referred to the sages that are knowledgeable in the Shastra. Therefore, you have this 3-point system of checks and balances. If the Guru says it, then you look to Shastra or scripture to see if it's there, and then you see if the past sages studying such Vedic or other scriptures concur that this is actually what it means, this is how you should respond to it. If all 3 line up, then you know you've got perfect knowledge, that your guru is speaking truthfully. So in the Vedic scripture that Krishna is referring to, there are 2 indirect systems of self-realization, and they are relevant to our discussion of these topics. The first is called Vyasti. It's a system of self-realization by studying the self as a fragment of the Supreme, moving progressively through the body from the most gross aspect, like say the Annamaya Kosha, the food body, all the way up to the bliss body, the bliss body, and ultimately Brahman. So we see this in this chart of chakras. These energy centers going from bottom to top are associated with the different layers of the body. So in this illustration, the Annamaya Kosha, the food body, the physical body that's literally made of food, is what we know as our physical body. And the system of yoga that directs us to understand the body upward and inward, from the most physical to the most metaphysical coverings. This is found in the Taittiriya Upanishad, in case you're wondering where this yogic conception of coverings or koshas comes from. So In this way, we move from the most physical thing to the least physical thing, all the way up to the spiritual body and the awakening of spiritual senses, with the understanding that the self is a small sample of the Supreme Self, just as a drop of ocean water is a sample of the ocean that you can study and thus understand the constitution of the entire ocean. The second kind of indirect system of self-realization is called samasti, studying the universe as the body of the Supreme. So once again, trying to understand the Supreme Person by inference or reference, hence indirect. Instead of approaching the Supreme Person directly, there's some manifestation or some representation of the Supreme Person that you study in order to get a sense of what the Supreme Person is. Any questions about any of this? Please, of course, pop your questions into the chat or Q&A. Our last two verses go together. The five great elements, the false ego, the intelligence, the unmanifested, the 10 senses along with the 11th, the mind, the 5 sense objects, desire, aversion, happiness, sorrow, the total sum and substance, consciousness and constancy. All these are considered in summary to be the field of activities and its transformations. So the 5 great elements refer to solids, liquids, radiant energy, gases, and space, more traditionally known as earth, water, fire, air, and ether. The false ego, the intelligence, and the mind, the 11th of the 10 senses, make up the subtle or metaphysical body, or one aspect of the metaphysical body. The 10 senses include eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and skin, plus 5 sense actions. So the actions associated with seeing, hearing, smelling, etc. The 5 sense objects. So now you've got 15 senses plus the 11th, or 15 items in the sensory category, 16 if you include the mind, plus the 5 great elements, 21, plus 22, 23, the false ego and the intelligence, and then the unmanifested would be 24. This is the stuff of Sankhya, and this is now once again circling back to subject matter that Krishna discusses in the 2nd chapter of the Bhagavad-gita. There's a whole portion of the 2nd chapter where Krishna introduces this idea of the distinction between the spirit and the body. That is a summary study of Sankhya, or enumeration of elements. Then, in what is actually the next verse, states of mind are listed. Desire, aversion, happiness, sorrow. So all different psychological conditions. The total sum and substance, or the aggregate, the entirety, what it all adds up to. Consciousness itself, and constancy, or willfulness. All these are considered to be the field of activities and its transformations. So, everything in the material world undergoes transformations. And the material world itself is understood to be a transformation of spiritual energy. So we've spoken about this also in previous chapters. And there's a very specific part of the Vedanta-sutras that describes how the material world comes into being as a result of transformation of energies, which is to say there is a source of energies. There's the Supreme Person, who is the energetic source. And that person has unlimited, inconceivable, variegated energies. And while the energies can undergo various transformations, the person is not transformed. The classic example of this is the transformation of clay into a clay pot by a potter. So the material cause of a clay pot is clay. And the person who transforms the clay into the clay pot is the efficient cause, the potter. And when a potter turns clay into a clay pot, there's a transformation of the clay into a clay pot, but the potter is not transformed. The potter remains unchanged. So this is a way to understand that the material world is actually spiritual by its constitution, but it has undergone a transformation for the sake of facilitating us as we are possessed by material consciousness and therefore require a material world through which we can attempt to usurp the position of the controller and enjoyer. In other words, the natural position of the Supreme Person around whom the world actually revolves. One way of understanding the word puruṣa is as enjoyer, and the actual puruṣa is the puruṣa vishesha, the Supreme Person, who is actually the source of everything and therefore naturally the rightful enjoyer of everything. Which takes us to the end of our set of verses for this evening. So, our quick review. We have now begun a round of faith-based questions from Arjuna. We have discussed the field and the knower of the field, and we have begun brief discussion of the doctrine of the transformation of energies as described by the Vedanta-sutras or the Brahma-sutras. And therefore, it is natural to understand that the material world itself goes through various transformations. And next time, we're going to discuss a little bit more about the implications of transformation in the material world and changeless transformation in the spiritual world, because the material world is a distorted reflection of the spiritual world. That is to say, the relative unreality of illusion in the material world is an upside down and backwards version of the real reality of the spiritual world. If things happen here, then things must also happen there, and yet it is changeless. So we'll take a look at this paradox next time. Meanwhile, if you have any questions or comments, last call for questions or comments for this evening, and if you have questions or comments later, or are watching or listening to this after the fact and would like to send your questions and comments to me, please do so at hari-kirtana.com. I'm always very happy to hear from you. Next time, we will look at a definition of knowledge and a definition of everything else as we cover verses 7 through 11 by my count. That will be 8 through 12 in some of your editions. Tess, I'm very happy to have you back. Thank you very much. Kamala Radha, you're very welcome. I look forward to seeing all of you next time. Until then, I hope you are well and wish you all good fortune. It is always a pleasure to be here with you. Honored to have you here with me. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a nice night.